for joining us again. This is getting close to the last week. This is the last week that has like a bunch of reading for our course on history, morality, and ethics in the 19th century American West, Red Dead Redemption 2. Your required readings this week, if you're an undergraduate student, was the last, I believe, 2 or 3 chapters, the last maybe 2 chapters in the epilogue from Tor Olson's Red Dead Redemption and History textbook, or Red Dead History. And then you also had the piece by Harry Frankfurt called The Concept of Will and the concept of will, and I think the freedom of a person, or the concept of maybe freedom of the will and the concept of the person. You got a chapter in Robert Kane's book introducing the kind of terrain about free will and how it's played a role historically and how it sort of plays a role still today in our discussions. And then for graduate students, there was the reading by Galen Strawson on freedom. And then I just don't remember off the top of my head. Dan, was there an additional history reading, graduate reading for this week?
No, I think it was just finishing up. Yeah, finishing up Olson.
Olson, that's right. Yeah. So today we're going to talk briefly about Olson's chapters. We'll also talk a little bit about agency and free will in philosophy and in history. So,
yeah. So it's that chapter 18, the Appalachian myth. This is kind of quintessential Americana. Always thought it's the Murphy brood that you stumble across in Red Dead is obviously this monstrous version of hillbillies, quote hillbillies. It makes me think back to, and I remember the game. It wasn't the greatest game, but I remember purchasing it right before I had my wisdom teeth out, and for that week after I played it, but it was called Redneck Rampage. And so it was played on these, but it plays into the sort of Appalachian myth, and sort of this identity. And I think in class we watched some clips from Deliverance, which from 1972.
Yeah,
right. It's one of those classic 70s movies. It's Burt Reynolds without a mustache.
That's wild.
It has the famous dueling banjos scene. But that movie definitely helped set the stage, for the 70s version of sort of the hillbilly stereotype.
Yeah.
But it was interesting, some of this stuff I didn't necessarily know in terms of the details, but that chapter 19, he calls the scramble for Appalachia. And this is the moment that once you've deforested parts of the Appalachian mountains, all of a sudden you find things like coal and salt.
Yeah.
And then the mining tycoons arrive. And again, you see this mostly in that Annisburg area.
That's right. Yeah.
The mining. And that's obviously in the very last chapter of the game, which I did finally, I did finish it this weekend, and now I'm in the episode.
Oh, that's excellent. I'm still getting close. I'm not quite there, but
yeah, I'm there's a part of me that wants to do a search on games that make anyone who plays it cry. And this game has to be up there with the emotional choking back as you near the end of at least chapter 6 before the epilogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, this is good writing.
Yeah. People regularly post online about how this game kind of ruins other games for them, or they just they're like, I've never cared about a fictional character ever, but I was heartbroken when Arthur's life comes to an end or whatever. And yeah, it's incredibly moving and well done, and that's part of why it's incredibly moving, right? Any really well done art is going to really touch you in that way. So
yeah, and I thought it was interesting too, because there's a person in our on campus that's writing about gender and feminism and stuff, and sort of the masculinity of the game. And it's interesting because the game, you can go into it with this, I'm going to become a gunfighter. I'm going to you could just do the negative honor, right? Be a bad
That's
person.
right. Yeah, be an outlaw.
Yeah, and but by the end, like and it allows you to be tough, right? Quote tough. But
Yep.
it's by the end of the game, it it's I think the subversive part is it forces you to care. Like it's that the empathy
Absolutely.
drives a
Absolutely.
stake through you. And I found that very subversive because I mean, I've only played a couple Grand Theft Autos, I think Vice City and then San Andreas, that first one.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't remember crying, like,
Sure.
or like
No, those
choking
games
up,
were, that's right. Yeah.
and I'm just like, I don't know if the others are like that, but boy, this is a game where it plays on all these American myths, but by the end of it, it forces people to look.
Yeah. Leaves you with a lump in your throat. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that this last part too, and this is just, one of my favorite chapters of the book, the Hatfields and McCoys.
Yeah. I love that one.
And I just keep thinking of that song. I don't even know the name of the song, but it says the Hatfields and McCoy. Like, oh yeah, you'd have to look it up.
Okay.
Um, it's just a throwaway line in the song, but I remember hearing that growing up, and then you just hear it as a metaphor for like feuds.
Mm.
It's a 70s. It's one of those songs I heard when I was a kid in the back of the station wagon running errands with my mom.
Okay. Is it Luckenbach, Texas? Back to the Basics of Love by Waylon Jennings?
Oh, okay, that's one of them. There's another one too.
Okay.
There is another one too. Yeah, and that's
Okay.
funny. We drove to Wichita and we were listening to a Waylon Jennings playlist, and that came on. I'm like, oh, there's another.
Oh, excellent. Excellent.
So, I was trying to show my daughter good country music. Um, but the whole idea that the Hatfield and McCoys were basically caught on the two different sides of these land grabs.
Yeah.
The other thing here, and I just literally landed on it um, on page 233, where it says it was an election day in Pike County, Kentucky.
Uh-huh.
So Pike County is where Hazard, Kentucky is.
Oh, okay.
And
So the
Hazard,
Dukes of Hazzard.
Kentucky was where, and this is from a previous conversation that's not in the podcast, but I worked on the Olmsted Lock and Dam project while I was in
That's
college,
right. That's
93,
right.
94 here and there, summers, and I took a fall off. And the people I worked with called themselves hillbillies, and they were from Pike County, but most of them were from Hazard.
That's
And
right.
so
That's
like,
right.
oh, the Dukes of Hazard, blah blah blah. And I'm like, yeah. And yeah, so I remember coming across that in the book. I'm like, hey, I know Pike County.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I worked
That's neat.
with some of the descendants.
That's
Uh,
right.
but yeah, I think it brings it in for a nice landing. I mean, it's the chapter sort of um, finishes the game in a
Yeah.
neat fashion.
Yeah. And I think it's also, one way, certainly not the best or only way to think about agency, but one way to think about agency is like, do I get to tell my own story? And I think do I get it? If you think of life, what makes a life meaningful is it has a kind of narrative structure. Then, like who's in control of the narrative, right? And so, um, I think in the context of, history in this class, what we've learned is, people just mostly do not get to tell their own history, and the history is told not just by the winners but also just by people with a sort of vested ideological interests or motivations or something like this, right? Um, and so I think, that's one way to kind of lead into our discussion of agency. We're only going to talk about this really quickly. And part of the reason is we thought that this would be a good object lesson in agency, right? Is for us to sort of discuss these things briefly and then really leave it to you to ponder them and think about them and try to get a sense of what you believe and what was really striking to you. And of course, if you would like to talk with us further about these, please shoot us an email, come to office hours. We'd be happy to set up an online Zoom or meeting to discuss it. So when you get to agency, a big thing is like free will. Why free will is important is because historically we've associated it, at least in past Western traditions, it's associated with the idea of moral responsibility. So if I am compelled by another person or by a deity or something, if I'm not in control of my own actions, if the cause of my action is a fit of madness or something, then we usually think that I'm held less responsible. Doesn't mean that you might not put me away somewhere, right? If I have a serious break from reality and I'm really harming other people, you might put me away to prevent harm from others, but it wouldn't be because you're holding me responsible for the actions I took, right? And even if you think about in the contemporary legal context of the country, when you learn information about someone, this is a point that Kane makes. If you start and all you hear is so and so, did this horrible action to someone else, and they weren't, at least at that time, not in their right mind or something, you probably just think, well, they deserve to be punished and they did that of their own free will, etc. But sometimes learning about their development, learning about their upbringing, learning about really pathologies that they might suffer from, that might compromise their decision making, it often has an effect that it kind of changes, abrogates or ameliorates our exact amount of responsibility we might want to attribute to them. And this really comes down to at least to some extent a capacity that we have. And so, Kane talked about this, and the Frankfurt piece talked about this, and the Strawson piece is another interesting sort of position. But basically, broadly speaking, in the debate, you've got people who are hard determinists. We'll talk about that in a second. Compatibilists and libertarians. These libertarians are not political libertarians, right? It's a particular view about the nature of free will. And the basic issue, sometimes it's causation that comes from physics or genetics or neuroscience. Historically, in the past, it was theological determinism, so it's coming from God. But is there something sort of that is a tension or that rules out that I have free agency if something else determines me? So I'll give you an example that we talked about in class. It might be the case, for example, that I don't know what I'm going to have for lunch tomorrow. I got a lot of options. Seems up to me. Seems like I could have a little wrap, or I could have a sandwich, or I could have a salad. These are all stuff that I have stuff for at home. And it seems to me that all of those options are available to me. But in the context of God, if God knows the future and God knows it infallibly, then God knows what I'm having tomorrow. And it seems like then there is only one fact of the matter. There's only one real option, which is whatever I will, quote unquote, choose to have tomorrow. And so it's almost like God's knowledge determines that I'm going to eat a sandwich or whatever it is tomorrow. And now people worry more about like physics, right? It's just, we think of ourselves as creatures made up of, ultimately at a basic level, atoms. And atoms and other physical things are subject to the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, etc. Even though we are complex creatures with consciousness and thought and all this other stuff, well, the stuff we're made up of is the same stuff that makes up rocks and water and canyons and all of this other stuff in the universe, right? And if all that other stuff doesn't have any agency because of how physical laws determine those things develop or how those events unfold, then presumably the same would be true of us, or at least that's one worry about this that sort of threatens it. So you have people who are libertarian, who think freedom requires alternative possibilities. Usually they think that. And since causal determinism means that I have no alternative possibilities, there's just one way things flow outward, right? And we could, if you're interested, let me know and we can talk a little bit about what it means for something to be causally determined, how that causal sequence is. So libertarians say, well, we do have free will, so things at some level can be totally deterministic, or maybe we're made of something, or we have some part of us that is not bound by contemporary physical laws, and that's why we have this sort of capacity. Compatibilists want to say, look, you don't need alternative possibilities for free will, free choice. All you need is that your decision-making came from your own motives in normal organic ways. So obviously your freedom is compromised, not because of determination or one pathway, but because something occurred that was, pathological. I had a brain tumor pressing on this part of my brain, and that's why it caused this motivation or action. Or someone's coercing you there or manipulating you by force, right? They've got a gun to your head, or they say, you've got to do this awful thing or we'll take out your family. But all of those are ways that you don't have free choice, but it's not because there's only one way things could go. It's because that choice results not from your own sort of motives and values and, your own orientation, but from some external factor that is not appropriately a part of that decision making process. And then you have people who are hard determinists who just say, actually, it looks like free will does require alternative possibilities, but the world as we know it is determined in this causal way. Even if there's quantum mechanical indeterminacy at a really low level, at a higher level, and especially creatures as big as us, all of that washes out and we function deterministically. So yeah, free will requires that. We don't have it. And so then, of course, the tricky part, if you're a hard determinist, is to say, well, what would we have to revise about our social practices, our interpersonal practices, our moral attribution? Because it would be quite widespread if we had to revise it on the basis of that, right? So part of why we did this, and I said as much in class, and so I'll say it here. Part of why we did this is we got to make this class, and I really like free will stuff, and so part of it is just I wanted us to talk about this. I'm one of the people in charge of the class. You got to talk about this, right? But the other reason is I think it's really important. If you remember in Schaefer Landau, he talked about how on the deontology, the Kantian chapters, that for Kant, free will is really important. But he kind of talked about it as if that's only true for Kant, that libertarian free will is important. But notice that think about any of the awful actions that we've talked about or seen in the game or seen in history. If no one really had any choice, if it wasn't really up to them, if there was no alternative than the way that things actually went, it is kind of hard to understand how you can blame or praise anyone for any action. So I think for just moral attribution in general, free will is actually quite important. And in the context of the game, obviously, we're thinking about this in terms of Arthur. How much free will does Arthur have? We're thinking about it maybe for yourself. And this really ties into Wen's discussion of agency in games, right? His view is that agency is the medium of games, right? You get to tinker with agency, reduce your own, expand it in ways that you can't in real life or whatever. And so thinking about agency is a part of a way to get into thinking about the nature of games, the nature of participation in games, and just the nature of, this in our broader life. This was kind of the point of some of that first season of Westworld on HBO, right? Is we look at all these robots that are programmed, but they mimic highly complicated behavior, even though they just have a series of programs. Well, of course, the point in that show is like how different are we really from them? And if the answer is not so different, and we don't think they have any agency or moral significance, then do we? It's just a really interesting, fruitful, complicated philosophical area. And I thought it's a good way to end our class is, by thinking about the nature of agency and free will and how it relates to moral behavior, how it relates to history, how it relates to the game, all of these things. So do you have any follow-up thoughts on that, Dan?
No, I mean, I think I, I, I liked how the readings wrap up sort of the gameplay, the game logic.
Yeah,
The game allows you free will. At the same time, there's a narrative, right? There has to be some kind of end. You're not
that's
going to
right.
get the choking back tears end if it was a free for all.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So yeah, I think and maybe in terms of video games, because there is the push for can you make the video game, you know, instead of the one ending in Red Dead 2, there's
Yeah.
50.
Could you make 50? Exactly. Yeah.
Um, and then would you make that into 100?
Yeah.
But then would you really want that? Right? Like,
Yeah.
do you want the end? Would that ruin the sort of 5, 6, 7, 10,000 year history of recorded or remembered tales that drive
That's right.
people? Like
Yeah.
uh is it pure whim, or is there a narrative arc that gives everyone meaning, and then you try to adhere to that narrative arc?
Yeah,
versus I'm just going to make my own route, which usually ends up with you being arrested for waving an old spear around at the center of an intersection,
that's right.
wearing the uniform of like from Kmart that you bought at the
Yeah.
secondhand store, and you're thrown in jail because your whim went too far.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. And, the other way I always think about this is, all of us probably are familiar, at least internally, with the sensation of a thing that's happening to us versus a thing we're doing, right? So I think about sometimes if I have too much coffee, like late in the afternoon, I have a hard time getting to sleep, but also it causes me to have some like kind of leg twitches, like a little restless leg action or whatever. And that does not seem like something I'm doing. It strikes me as qualitatively something that is happening to me, right? I'm not trying to make my leg like twitch. It's just a thing that's happening. I'm just like, dang, I wish my leg would stop twitching or whatever it is, right? Because of the coffee and caffeine intake. At the same time, there are times when I decide, I need a refill of my water glass, or I think I'm going to go make some popcorn or whatever. And so that feeling of sort of voluntary agency starts in a process where I get up out of the chair and I walk over to the kitchen and I direct myself. I'm doing it all in a way where it's like I'm bringing about some occurrence of something, right? Even if it's something as simple as filling up my cup of water or whatever, right? And so one way to think about the agency part of this is, you know, we do usually want to keep a role for like action versus just event, right? Action is like a thing I'm doing or a thing where I'm active versus something where it's very passive, like an event is happening to me. But on a certain view, on that hard determinist view, it's really just, you're just sort of the occasion of an unfolding of events that you really are not in control of. And that's, I think, just an interesting way to think about this. So I don't really have anything else. We will, we will let you ponder this and exercise your own agency. And then, of course, you might be thinking if you read the stuff, or can I? We'll see. So that's all I've got.
Yep.
Have a
See you
good
next
day.
class.
That's right.